Ascent Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents George Soros, A Life in Full. Edited by Peter L.W. Osnos. Narrated by George Newbern, Petrea Burchard, Shaun Grindell, and Earl Mclean. Introduction. Peter L.W. Osnos. The name George Soros is world famous, and yet the man himself is surprisingly little understood. Depending on who or where you are, describing Soros is likely to elicit different answers. He has even more identities than he has lived decades, now into his 10th. In addition to survivor, billionaire, speculator, philanthropist, activist, author, nemesis of the far right, and global citizen, there is husband, father, and to an extent he may not even realize, friend. The first 8 of these are Soros's public profile, and they are the focus of this book. Over the years, attempts have been made to write George Soros's biography, but no single account of his life can capture its extraordinary, multifaceted character. The writers whose work appears in this volume have approached Soros from the perspective of those whose expertise in their fields have enabled them to provide a description of his activities and, to the extent possible, the motivation for them and their impact. There will be places where the narratives overlap. Think of these as interlocking pieces of a puzzle covering a vast area. Some essays may not altogether reach the same conclusions. On a canvas this wide, this is perhaps inevitable. And with so much to cover, there may well be less of some activities than of others, but the breadth of these portrayals is considerable. Essential to this process was that the writers have complete confidence in their independence of judgment, along with the responsibility to be accurate and fair-minded, while also recognizing that anyone writing about another person will bring his or her own experience to the task. The essays are not intended to describe in detail how Soros's activities and initiatives have developed over the decades. Suffice to say that the paths have not always been smooth. In finance, there are straightforward measures of outcome: money spent, money earned, profit and loss. In philanthropic areas, success or failure is more difficult to assess because there are few clear metrics. Have the efforts and expenditures provided the desired results? When situations and personalities require changes to be made, how are these handled? The answers to these questions, especially at the Open Society Foundations and Central European University, among the most ambitious philanthropic commitments of modern times, are yet to come. These institutions have been founded by Soros, funded by Soros, and are ongoing. All the essays in the book are portrayals of George Soros's experiences and vision and how he uses his wealth. He does seek counsel, advice, and information from other people, but the ultimate decisions have been and will continue to be his, as long as he can make them. This is not always popular. So, this volume has been compiled with the assurance that it would be the best possible representation of George Soros's life we can achieve. And he and his family did not read it until it was completed. I have guided the project with the assistance of Paul Golub, the estimable editor who has worked with me to bring the essays to final form. The opinions expressed, as the saying goes, are those of the authors. It will not be surprising if Soros's critics find some fault with the essays. My own dealings and fascination with Soros began in the 1980s, as he became involved with human rights issues, particularly Human Rights Watch. As a former journalist in the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and Southeast Asia, including the war in Vietnam, and by personal instinct, I was also an advocate and interpreter of human rights issues. In 1997, I founded the publishing house Public Affairs, whose very first list included Soros's book, The Crisis of Global Capitalism, Open Society Endangered. All his books that have followed were likewise published by Public Affairs, as well as in dozens of countries around the world. My latest publishing venture, Platform Books LLC, is co-publishing this book with Harvard Business Review Press to assure the broadest possible reach for the book in the world marketplace. In a book of my own, An Especially Good View, Watching History Happen, I reflected on George Soros and our engagement over the years. I made the case that Soros was one of 3 individuals who were instrumental in the ultimate demise of the Soviet Empire. The others were the great Soviet scientist and dissident Andrei Sakharov and Pope John Paul II. Sakharov because of the universal acclaim for his humanism and democratic beliefs, John Paul because he became the symbol throughout Eastern Europe of defiance of Kremlin orthodoxy, and Soros because the combination of principles and wealth enabled him to back the avatars of Western open society where they did not exist. As the Soviet Empire entered its final stages before dissolving in 1991, Soros was, in many ways, the capitalist fantasy of all latter-day communists, a very, very rich man. What the Soviets and Eastern Europeans did not recognize about Soros was that his genius for making money was matched by his passion for the open society, as defined by the philosopher Karl Popper. In the years of glasnost and perestroika, and the early years of the post-Soviet era, Soros created an infrastructure of civil society organizations and support for democratic ideals and education. What the communists and their successors missed was that Soros was subversive to their ideology, a radical as well as a billionaire. Increasingly after 2000, as the politics of these countries deteriorated after early hopefulness, pressure on the open society enterprises grew. The record of the post-Soviet era is still unfolding. Nonetheless, an entire generation of people saw what was possible in progressive reform. In the years since, Soros has continued to refine his guiding philosophical and financial thesis called reflexivity, the way events and trends influence how markets sway, often with unintended consequences. Knowing how to make the right early calls was a source of Soros's genius and enormous wealth. In particular, the great international recession of 2008 and 2009 was widely seen as a validation of his sense of how market distortions, such as subprime mortgages, can convulse economies. Soros was very proud of his open society philanthropy and activism. But I think he took exceptional pleasure in finally being recognized for his philosophy. Over the years, Soros became a major nemesis to the global extreme right wing, which has deployed a mix of conspiracy theories and anti-Semitic tropes to discredit his activities on behalf of progressive causes and civil society. The bizarre notion that he is a mastermind of everything the right-wingers around the world reject is nonsense. The attacks are not easy to ignore, especially when a bomb was placed in the mailbox at his home in Bedford, New York. Yet Soros has displayed extraordinary equanimity, at least as I could measure, in almost every way. Michael Vachon, his savvy longtime advisor on media and politics, said one evening as we sat at dinner, "George, no one is ever going to feel sorry for you, having to endure the slings and arrows of fame and fortune." What did bother Soros, I thought, was that in his homeland of Hungary, the autocratic leader Viktor Orbán, who had once studied at Oxford as a Soros-funded fellow, made Soros the focus of his nativist political strategy. In time, I came to understand the significance of Soros's personal heritage, that the influence of his father, Tivadar, in the war years, was a basis for his own daring and risk-taking in finance, and in life generally. All this, and a great deal more, is discussed in these essays. Each of the writers is a highly respected expert in the aspect of Soros's life and work they are exploring. The opening essay is by Eva Hoffman, whose early years in Poland, in the immediate aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust, gave her a particular understanding of Soros's experiences during that time and the impact on his life. Her own admired books prepared her for this account of his background and early years. Sebastian Mallaby is a writer who can, with extraordinary clarity, explain the development of Soros's career as a speculator, Soros's own term, his instincts about how to amass wealth, and how he has shaped the modern world of finance. Darren Walker, as the president of the Ford Foundation, is a preeminent 21st century philanthropic leader. He is also a black man and proudly gay. Walker explains Soros's approach to philanthropy, how it fits in today's world, and why it has been so meaningful to him and others who have been underserved and victims of racism and bigotry. Gary LaMarche led the launch of the Open Society Foundation's work in the United States. As president of the Democracy Alliance, LaMarche has joined in Soros's involvement with U.S. politics and was fully aware of the relentless attacks of the far right, startling in their crudeness and falsehoods. LaMarche combines a career in civil liberties and human rights with an acute awareness of political strengths and failings. Ivan Krastev is of the generation that emerged after the fall of the Soviet Empire, which enables him to write with a measure of distance about how Soros took on the challenge of bringing open society principles to places it had not been, and the frustrations that were perhaps, in retrospect, inevitable. Michael Ignatieff is an acclaimed author who deploys his philosophical ideas to practical application in institutional leadership. As the former rector of Central European University, an institution founded by Soros, he has seen the great asset it can be, as well as the difficulty in fulfilling its vision. Orville Schell, one of the world's foremost experts on China, helped guide Soros in his interactions with the ascendant superpower. With his equally brilliant wife, the late Baifeng Schell, he became an advisor to Soros, and in the process, a confidant. Leon Botstein is a scholar, a college president for nearly 50 years, and a well-known orchestra conductor with a deep appreciation of the identities that have defined George Soros, as a Jew, as a survivor, and as an innovator in many fields of consequence. Botstein is an exceptionally astute interpreter of Soros's persona and his place in history. This book is not a philanthropic exercise. It has been funded by a private entity that is backed by Soros's wealth, though not by his open society foundations. That money will be repaid from revenues the book accrues. In other words, this book is a business venture of an unusual kind, and given the subject, this should not be altogether surprising. As I wrote at the outset, no book can be sufficiently broad to describe every aspect of Soros's life. There are parts that only he can truly examine, his approach to family, for instance, and insights that are only his to share. What you have in this book is, as nearly as anyone can do it, George Soros's life in full.
Origins. Eva Hoffman. George Soros is a monumental figure whose outsized dimensions can be measured in many ways. In the sheer size of his fortune, in the international impact of his human rights and pro-democracy work, and in the success of the various causes he has supported. All this we more or less know. But what do we know of George Soros as a person? Is it possible to envisage him as a child or an adolescent boy? I doubt that many people's imagination would extend that far. Like many world-famous figures, Soros, to those who don't know him personally, is a kind of abstraction or a brand, rather than a living, breathing, emotionally complicated, as which one of us is not, human being. And yet, of course, George Soros was once a child, and as it happens, his childhood was extremely eventful. It was also, and for more than personal reasons, powerfully formative. Soros was born in Budapest in 1930. When World War II broke out, he was 9 years old. During the months of 1944 to 45, when Hungary was invaded and occupied by Germany, he turned 14. For those who are at all acquainted with the course of World War II, these dates speak volumes. They mean that George's childhood and early adolescence coincided with the most cataclysmic event of the 20th century, which, moreover, wrought its greatest ravages in Eastern Europe, and particularly to its Jewish populations. And yet, several decades later, in his foreword to Masquerade, his father's memoir of those years, George Soros, reflecting on his wartime childhood, and particularly its most dangerous period, wrote, "It is a sacrilegious thing to say, but these 10 months were the happiest times of my life. We were pursued by evil forces, and we were clearly on the side of the angels because we were unjustly persecuted. Moreover, we were trying not only to save ourselves, but also to save others. What more could a 14-year-old want?" Later still, when I asked 90-year-old George during a COVID-bound Zoom conversation if he still stood by those startling sentences, his first response was to joke that his memory isn't very good anymore, and that he only remembers the future. "I think more about the future," he added, "and also, I happen to be very happy now." To hear this from a person of his age is wonderfully inspiriting, even inspiring, and it is possible that his capacity for happiness was also seeded in his early years. Eventually, George said that he stood by his sacrilegious statement, and I think those sentences about his wartime childhood provide quite a few clues to who he is and who he has become. For those who lived through World War II, and especially through the Holocaust, that experience of ultimate danger and survival affected everything that came after: personal fate, inner life, views of the world, and the shape of character. This was true for George and his older brother Paul no less than for their parents. But for all of them, there was life before, which had its shaping influences as well. It is perhaps hard for most of us to imagine life in the other Europe in the early part of the 20th century. But pre-war Budapest, where Paul and George grew up, and where their parents spent a good portion of their lives, was a beautiful Middle-European city, sitting on 2 sides of the Danube, its former grandeur as part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire inscribed in its splendidly ornate parliament building, its long and complex history readable in its many monuments, its Epicurean character palpable in its luxuriant public baths and in its many cafes, which, especially before the war, were sites of intimate conversation and lively political discussion. Pre-war Mitteleuropa was a much less Puritan or work-driven part of Europe than its western regions, never mind North America. It was also home to highly sophisticated cultures. In his own memoir, written in America in the 1990s, Paul Soros, born 4 years before George, remembers that in the city of his youth, despite the hateful undercurrents of nationalist chauvinism and anti-Semitism, political discourse, literature, and sports flourished, as did theater, music, opera, in a cosmopolitan atmosphere that, despite our best efforts and greater material resources, we were not able to match for our children. Culture matters, and Tivadar Soros, George's father, was a very Mitteleuropean personality. He was a lawyer by training, multilingual, worldly, well-read, and well-informed. But by the time the 1930s came around, he had forsworn hard work and spent much of his time in those pleasant baths and cafes, eating delicious pastries in good company, and undoubtedly flirting as well. This was true of many Hungarians of his class and financial means. But as George pointed out in conversation, in Tivadar's case, there was an important difference. Before his turn to this easygoing lifestyle, his father had lived through his own life-changing experiences of extreme danger and survival. These are worth dwelling on, if only because of their impact both on Tivadar's actions during World War II and on George's imagination and later attitudes. In condensed summary, Tivadar's time of trial followed on his volunteering to fight in the Austro-Hungarian army in World War I. He apparently took this step not out of patriotism, but because he didn't want to miss out on the adventure. But if adventure was his aim, he eventually got more of it than he bargained for. After a period of relatively easygoing soldiering, he was captured by the Russians and interned in a prisoner-of-war camp in Siberia. While there, he managed, rather amazingly, to publish a newspaper called The Plank. He also used the time to bolster his knowledge of Esperanto, a universal language invented at the end of the 19th century, which became the lingua franca of various international movements. Tivadar would remain engaged in the Esperanto movement and its publishing house until late in his own life. Masquerade was first written in that language. George's internationalist tendencies had good family precedents. Tivadar's period of captivity, however, also included more grimly instructive incidents. During his internment, he witnessed the execution of a prisoner's representative, after some captives managed to escape. This led to his refusal to accept such a position himself, and to the lesson, very useful during the war to come, that it doesn't always pay to be prominent. Instead, realizing that the situation was increasingly hopeless, he proceeded to organize a mass escape. This involved travel by train, raft, mule, and pony, and an unfortunate geographical mistake which meant that for a while the escapees found themselves unintentionally headed toward the Arctic Ocean. Once they reversed tracks, Tivadar's journey home took several months and involved various dangers and privations, possibly including torture. But eventually he made his way to Moscow, by that time the capital of post-revolutionary Russia, and then, through further guile and deception, back to Hungary. One can easily imagine the impact such true tales of danger and daring-do had on the impressionable young minds of his sons. As George put it in his foreword, "I learned the art of survival from a grand master." World War I, Esperanto, and his father's adventures were part of George's prehistory, even if they were deeply internalized and vividly present in his imagination. But for Tivadar, these were apparently adventures enough. In George's view, his father, after living through the Russian Revolution, came back a changed man. Before his escapades, he was apparently an ambitious young man, trained as a lawyer and eager to achieve great things. Afterward, he was simply happy to be alive. He decided to devote himself to enjoying life rather than to more conventional achievements, especially since money didn't seem to matter to him very much. In his foreword, George says that his father was the only man he knew who systematically decumulated his assets. Mind you, much later, George did something analogous, on a much larger scale, when he decided to stop devoting himself to making money and to dedicate his time to worthwhile causes instead. That was when he was already very much his own man, but perhaps one can discern his father's influence in this radical and highly unusual step as well. Tivadar's easygoing lifestyle was greatly facilitated by marriage to his second cousin, Erzsébet Skuch, whom he met when she was just 16. Marriages of such close relations may seem unusual or even dubious to us today, but in that earlier age, and especially among Jewish families, they were not uncommon. Erzsébet was 10 years younger than Tivadar, and according to her oral memoirs, fell in love with him at first sight, giving up her ambition to acquire a college education in order to enter into a relationship with him. She was a very different character from Tivadar, quite timid, given to spiritualist tendencies, and suffering from nervous states and occasional ulcers. She also brought to the marriage considerable material assets. Her father, Mor Skuch, was a successful businessman until he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia at a late age, nurturing the unfounded conviction that his wife was unfaithful to him with his business partner. Given his state, he could no longer manage his wealth. Instead, Tivadar was put in charge of his businesses, which included a famous fabric shop as well as properties in Budapest, Vienna, and Berlin. He received a management fee for various transactions and accumulated a very satisfactory income without putting in too many working hours. This, too, was part of George's significant history. His own story began in the interval between the wars, with what can fairly be described as a happy childhood. His earliest years don't seem to have been marked by any unusual drama, but one important event occurred in 1936 when he was 6 years old, and his parents decided to change the family name from Schwartz to Soros. This was not an uncommon practice among educated and assimilated, or at least acculturated, Hungarian Jews, but it is also possible that Tivadar stayed alert to worrying developments in Germany and that his decision was driven by a sense of potential danger. In 1936, anti-Jewish laws had not yet been enacted in Hungary, but Tivadar, who was multilingual and politically savvy, listened to the BBC's German broadcasts and probably read newspapers in German as well as Hungarian, perhaps in those sociable cafes where newspapers were kept on hand for customers. Most of all, he knew how to read the signs of the times. If George could say several decades later that his family was different in its attitudes from other Hungarian Jews, in ways that soon came to have crucial consequences, this was because of Tivedar's Russian education and what it taught him about totalitarian systems. He undoubtedly followed the rise of the Nazis in Germany and Austria and was aware that the infamous Summer Olympics that year took place under the sign of the swastika. In another vein, Erzsébet argued for a name change as well, so that her sons would not be stigmatized, especially since George was beginning school that year. The choice of the particular name might have had some added significance. Soros means next in line in Hungarian, and possibly indicated a symbolic passing of the baton by Tivadar to his sons. In addition, Tivadar would have known that in Esperanto, the word Soros is the future tense of the verb to soar, a connotation that undoubtedly appealed to him. Apart from such serious events, life for George and his older brother in their early years was easygoing, pleasurable, and full of vigorous physical activities. In the 1930s, the family spent their summers on Lupa Island, an outcropping on the Danube just outside Budapest that could be reached only by water, and which featured a small number of summer cottages, about half of them owned by middle-class, acculturated Jewish families. The Soros cottage was a small but striking Bauhaus-style villa, designed by the well-known architect Georgi Farkas, who was a family friend. There were 2 tennis courts established on the island at Tivadar's initiative, where George probably acquired his passion for tennis. At the age of 90, he still plays 3 times a week. And his parents had a small stand where they sold coffee and pastries, which became popular with the island's vacationers and the numerous rowers who passed alongside the island. Erzsébet was trained in making gerbeau pastries, made famous by a renowned Budapest café. George spent a lot of time kayaking in the Danube, and he and Paul were allowed to swim in the deep river by themselves from an early age, to the surprise of many onlookers. But apparently, leisure and pleasure were not sufficient for George, and in an endearingly childish version, he began to show philanthropic tendencies early on. While vacationing on the island, he established a newspaper called Lupa News, and according to a local reminiscence by a rather more conventional journalist, dated December 1939, 9-year-old George was this publication's author, editor, reporter, and distributor, using his earnings from its sales to contribute to worthy causes. In the journalist's account, the apple-faced, smiling little guest visited his quarters in order to donate money to the Finns. They are fighting a freedom fight now, Daddy said. Whether Daddy also suggested the donation is not recorded in the annals of history, but his influence on George was clearly discernible in this gesture. Perhaps one can also discern early signs of George's business instincts, as well as his self-confidence, in an anecdote recounted to Tivadar by a stationery shop owner in Budapest and recorded in Erzsébet's later recollections. After coming into the store one day, George looked around and decided that the goods were not displayed to the best advantage. He then proceeded to advise the rather astonished shop owner on how to rearrange things, advice which the man apparently followed and did not regret. On Lupa Island, Tivadar played with his own and other children as if he were one of them. He invented a cry, "Papua," by which they could summon each other as if they were brave Indian warriors. He also recounted an ongoing story, a sort of children's serial called A Mosarega, about a miraculous machine whose name combined beginnings of the words for airplane, motorcycle, car, and garage, and which could be magically converted into any of these things. According to an account by Michael Kaufman in his biography of George Soros, Tivadar would, for example, inform the boys that he had received a call from Mahatma Gandhi in India, who, it seemed, needed their help. In that case, as he told it, he and the brothers first flew to Central Asia and then, after turning a Mosarega into a car, drove over the Hindu Kush, talking their way out of difficulties among the fierce Pathans as they headed toward their rendezvous with Gandhi. Such tales kept his young listeners in a state of enchantment and, without any overt didacticism, provided incidental lessons in geography and important issues of the day. Of course, no idyll is complete without its difficulties. Aside from play and pleasure, there was, during George's childhood, a webwork of less overt family relations.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?